Okay, so starting with the style element of academic writing, there are several things that I want to go into detail, like writing style, vocabulary, grammar, all of these things. So let's start with, and I will try as always to give you some suggestions, but let's start with the writing style. I think that is something very important because if you think about doing research, maybe you're thinking about a very kind of objective oriented, like maybe something that works in physics, math, biology, like sciences, where it is okay to do it like that, where it is okay to kind of be very short on what do you want to say. But in business administration, if you remember the research philosophy lecture, we are kind of in the middle between subjectivity and objectivity. Even if you write a quantitative thesis, you are not totally quantitative, like if you are studying math or physics, you're studying people. In the end, you're studying businesses. So because of that, it's quite unique. You need to have some materiality, some objectivity, but at the same time you have a lot of subjectivity in there. So because of that, in business administration, we have this very unique setting with where and we will go into detail on that, on how to write, but we can't be that kind of robotic, and at the same time we can be that kind of romantic, if I can call it like that. We can be that extremely human or extremely computer. We have to be somewhere in the middle. And then in business administration, we also have quite an interesting setting. I think I will go into detail later in the structure, but the organization of the thesis is more or less like this, like with a hierarchy where the biggest element or the largest element are chapters. So you structure your thesis in chapters. Then each chapter has sections where you discuss different things. I will go on these two things on detail later on in the second video. And then each section also has subsections. And this is when things get tricky, because sometimes it's easy to differentiate what goes in which chapter, and sometimes even in which section of the chapter, but then it becomes difficult to differentiate between subsections, especially when you are writing. Like you are reporting something that happened, and it's like you try to write everything, and then it's difficult to put it together. What belongs in where? And then even more difficult, each paragraph in business administration, we do it like this. Each paragraph should contain an individual idea. Like sometimes we talk about the same idea over maybe different paragraphs, and maybe it's too much, or maybe it's just that we're spreading out the same idea over different things, and that's confusing. So then it gets trickier because each paragraph should be an independent kind of body that is, of course, connected with other paragraphs, but that idea of having a paragraph as an individual unit is kind of difficult to do, and even more difficult on sentences. Spanish is my mother tongue, so in Spanish we try to use a lot of words in one sentence, and that is the opposite of what happens in academic writing. In academic writing, we want to have short sentences that are easy to read. So it's also a challenge. Sentences should not be that long. Like sometimes some people write a paragraph that is only one sentence. That's very confusing. So keep in mind these units that we have when we write. Then we move to another very important aspect, vocabulary. When we talk, we use synonyms all the time, and usually it's a nice thing to do. Like it can be a bit boring if we use the same word all over again when we talk. But when we write, it's the opposite. And why is it like that? Because if we in academic writing, we are kind of arguing about concepts, and we are discussing concepts. So if we decide to change the word referring to the same concept, that can be extremely problematic. And here is an example. If you are referring to a company, you should refer it to a company all the time, because the word company means something. There is something that is just for company. If you say company and then in the next paragraph you say firm, or you write firm, the reader will be a bit confused, because the reader will say, is it the same? If it is the same, why didn't you use company? Or maybe you are referring to something different, and is that true or not? And then confusion is the worst when you are reading. So about vocabulary, the first point is to avoid synonyms. Be careful with it. The next point is about not kind of try not to feel smart by using strange words. Try to use easy language. Of course, you will end up using some concepts that maybe they're confusing. Like, for example, even in research philosophy, we have ontology and epistemology, very strange words. Some of them you can't avoid, but they're familiar and they're normal in research, so it's okay. But try not to bring all of these confusing words. If you find a simple word, use a simple word. Try to avoid this confusion thing. Maybe this works better, I don't know, in other contexts, but try to use a vocabulary that is kind of no, I don't want to say that word, but kind of normal in business administration. And the other thing is also be careful with abbreviations. Like sometimes we have, like, for example, SMEs, small and medium enterprises. We all know what is an SME, but every time that you have an abbreviation, it is a good practice to have first the whole word, like the full phrase, like small and medium enterprises, and then in parentheses SMEs, and then from there you refer to SMEs all the time. You can also have like a table with the abbreviations that you're using if you have too many, but just be careful because sometimes we have abbreviations that not everyone understands, so be careful on that. So this is more or less some suggestions on the vocabulary. Then in grammar, maybe I'm not the best person to talk about grammar because I'm not the best in grammar. Also, English is not my primary language, so it can be I'm not the best example. But maybe I can give you some suggestions. For example, one of the things that you should be careful about is to be consistent with the tenses. If you write on past tense, then you should write everything on past tense. Or if you write in present, it's very confusing when you have past and present. Sometimes you have to, for example, maybe you write everything in present, but then when you were writing a case, if you're doing qualitative, maybe you have to report something from the past and then you use past. It's still okay, but you have to be very careful and you have to be very smart on how to do it. But for example, if you're writing the introduction, it's better if you keep the same tense, like present, like sustainability is a problem or sustainability was a problem. These two things mean different things. So think carefully what do you want to say and then keep that consistency. Then another thing that maybe you have in mind, a question that maybe you are thinking about, is it better to write in first person or in third person? Usually we say that when you are doing qualitative, we use first person because we want to show that we are there. So you say like, we did interviews, we visited the company. So you write in first person. And when you are doing quant, you are usually use third person to kind of stay away from that. If you think about research philosophy, it makes sense because in qual you want to be in there, you want subjectivity, in quant you want objectivity. So it makes sense. But in the end, it's not a sin if you write in the other way around. Like it just, again, be consistent on whatever you choose. And again, maybe discuss with your supervisor. But usually that's the practice. And then another thing that it is very difficult when you're reading that it confuses the reader is if you use a lot of passive voice. And if you read something from math or biology or something like that, passive voice is used a lot. But again, it's because it's different. In these sciences, they want to stay away from the phenomenon. They don't want to have any accountability of being in there. So they use passive voice. In here, in business administration, that's confusing. It's better to use active voice all the time. So don't say like interviews were made. Don't say like that. Say who did the interviews. We did the interviews, or the researchers did the interviews, depending if you use first or first. But don't use passive voice. Be very careful with passive voice. And then another kind of headache when you are almost done with your thesis is the formatting. And first of all, Word can be extremely messy. Like if you add an image, then it can destroy everything. So be very careful. I think you have to be very smart. I think in the library you can get some help about using Word because it's very messy. And then some things that you should be careful with, because every time you jump and start a new section or something, it's just like it can destroy the whole document. So try to check overall the font, the size, the margin space, orientation, all of these technical things that you have to be careful about. And then figures and tables are also very complicated in Word because it changes a lot of things. And then something very, very useful that I use since I was a PhD student, and then now that I'm working as assistant professor, is this software referencing tools. Like these softwares are very useful because you can have like your own library of references, and then it's easy to use it in Word. Doing the manual referencing can be easy at first because it's just doing it, and maybe if you have 10 or 12 it's manageable, but in a thesis you end up having like 50, 60 references, 70 maybe, so it's a lot, and sometimes it's better to have this kind of software. I will try to write a tutorial about how to use EndNote, because you need to invest maybe a couple of hours to kind of understand how it works. It's not difficult, it's very intuitive, but you need some time to invest. But I think it's good investment. It will save a lot of time in your writing and revising. Trust me, I've done both ways, without and with, and it's much better with. So that's another suggestion in terms of the references. And then another thing, maybe like the big picture of all of this writing style, is the coherence, the overall thing. Like the thesis is usually not written individually, it's usually in groups. So it is sometimes, even if you write it individually, you're not the same person cognitively at the beginning and in the end. So the coherence of the whole thesis can be at risk if you don't revise it. Like what you wrote in the introduction, when you try to problematize the topic and all of this, and you wrote a research question, probably is not going to be the same kind of idea, general idea, to where you finish. So my suggestion is that revise what you wrote before when you are done. So usually you would like to finish a few weeks before the deadline, so you have that time to come back, and it's perfectly normal, because when you started your research, you didn't know what you will find. So maybe you will say like, for sustainability strategies, finance is very important, but we don't understand how it works in this specific context. I don't know, whatever. So we need to, that's the problematization. We don't know how financing works in this specific context, so we need to start. That's the general problematization. But when you did your research, then you realize that maybe something important is power in there. Like maybe the element of power is very relevant in financing a sustainable strategy. So because of that, my suggestion is go back to the introduction and highlight the element of power. Use this on your favor when you problematize, of course, like we need to study more financing in sustainable strategies, because we don't know how it works in this context. Because maybe power is relevant. We have seen that power is relevant in this context, in this other stuff like human resource, I don't know, you include a reference. So maybe power is relevant. And then you go and do your research, and then in your findings, you show that, and then in the discussion, you discuss the element of power in financing a sustainable strategy. The reader will be very excited. The reader will see everything like in a, like the line that connects everything. And that can't be done in a like only linear. It has to be a loop. It's impossible to do it like this. Like, you know where you will end, you will never know. You need to come back. So these two suggestions, first of all, because it's group work, or even if it's individual, you need to be very conscious all the time of what you are doing, what you are saying, because every day is different, every person is different. You have to achieve some coherence. And the second thing is that you need to come back. You need to go back to the introduction and rewrite the introduction to show where you're going to finish. So these two suggestions are very important. Then I will try to go a bit quicker in here. I think it's I'm also not the best person for this. I think maybe someone in the library can be the best person to talk about the APA style, which is what we say that we use usually in our thesis. I'm not sure if you can use MLA. Maybe you can check with the examiner. But usually we use APA. It's the most very popular in business administration, and there is a kind of new version. I think it's the 8th version that you can check. And APA is not only for references, it actually also affects how you report your tables, figures, appendixes. So I suggest to learn about APA style, not only for references, but other things. So spend also some time, maybe a couple of hours. I know that in the library, they have some mini courses that you can take. I know that also in your courses, normal courses, you have papers where you have to use APA. So just get familiarized with this. And kind of a similar trend, besides the APA style, we also have like a Jönköping University style. I have to be honest, and not everything is totally APA. Sometimes we also have some stuff that we only use in Jönköping. So again, with the examiner, read the the student guide of the thesis to make sure about the length, the formalities that you have to do, the GDPR documents that you have to fill up, all of these things that are more kind of individual for the university. So I think that's the end of this first one side of the coin about writing. The next part is about the structure. And so now we'll see that in the next video.